Section 1 of 3 Supernatural Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Supernatural Stories by Wilhelmina FitzClarence. The Tyburn Ghost. Some years ago, a lady and her 3 daughters, who generally resided in the country, had reason to visit the metropolis. After some trouble in the way of house hunting, they settled in a lodging located in a small street in close proximity to the Marble Arch, Hyde Park. It was summer time, about the middle of July, and the heat being intense, the atmosphere, or the want of it, in a small lodging-house was very oppressive. Mrs. Dale, however, was not very sensitive to stuffiness, besides which, had she been so, she was not well off enough to afford a more spacious dwelling. Indeed, had it not been for the landlady's obliging disposition, and readiness to accede to some alterations suggested by Mrs. Dale in the arrangement of the apartment, the latter lady would have been forced to seek a pied-à-terre in a still less fashionable locality than even Dash Street. But to make our story clear, we must describe the relative positions of the rooms in Dash Street, as well as what were the slight alterations suggested by Mrs. Dale, and carried out by the obliging Mrs. Parsons, who, knowing that the season was more than half over, felt it was better to put herself out a little than not to let her rooms at all. Number 5 Dash Street was a tenement of the most conventional furnished apartment type, and the rooms hired by Mrs. Dale consisted of 2 small sitting rooms on the drawing-room floor, with folding doors between them, and 1 tolerably good-sized bedroom on the upper story, situated exactly above the front sitting-room. There was a large 4-poster in this upper bedroom, in which the 2 elder young ladies agreed to repose together, and Mrs. Dale persuaded the landlady to allow another 4-poster to be placed in the back sitting-room, for her convenience and that of her youngest daughter, they also electing to sleep therein together. This was an economical arrangement, necessitating the use of only 2 beds instead of 4, or at least of 3, and, as lodging-house keepers charge according to the number of the beds used, the arrangement was a satisfactory one for Mrs. Dale. Upon the appointed day, rather late in the evening, the Dale family arrived in Dash Street. Mrs. Dale had had some business to transact in the city, so, after a frugal supper, they began to think of retiring for the night. Mrs. Parsons, being a busy, hard-working woman, was nothing loath, and soon brought in the extra bed, toilet table, etc., and after bidding her lodgers a hearty good night, left them to themselves. Mrs. Dale had already thrown herself into the expectant arms of an inviting fauteuil, intent upon enjoying a free and easy yawn, when she suddenly noticed for the first time that there was a balcony outside the window which ran along the whole row of the Dash Street houses. Not being of an imaginative temperament, however, the only nocturnal danger which presented itself to the lady's innocently conventional mind was cats. Thereupon the following colloquy took place between her and her daughter Minnie, who was to be her bedfellow. "Minnie, mind you shut that window." "By all means, mother. And mind you lock it too, for I am terrified at cats." Minnie was a very dutiful daughter, but all the same she could not but think, in her inner consciousness, that if the window were shut, it would take a very uncommon cat to open it, even if it were not locked. She, however, silently and humbly obeyed orders, and, after much straining and struggling, managed to shut and lock the window, thus imprisoning within the stuffy little room the pleasing odour of the evening meal, which had consisted of pickled salmon and Welsh rarebit, and also effectually preventing the entrance of the least breath of fresh air. "And now that we are comfortable," said Mrs. Dale, whose complexion was shining from a combination of heat and eat, "we may as well go to bed." Accordingly, having kissed and dismissed her 2 daughters, who were to sleep upstairs, she and Minnie commenced disrobing themselves in the back sitting-room. "I think," said Mrs. Dale, after pondering a little, "that if we lock both the doors which open into the drawing-rooms from the staircase, we might safely sleep with the folding doors open between the 2 rooms, and so be cooler, and we shall get more air. That is, the atmosphere of the pickled salmon, etc. Don't you think?" "We will do so," said the obedient Minnie, flinging open the folding doors. She then kissed her mother affectionately, and got into bed. Now the room was small, and the 4-poster was large, so it had been found necessary to place the latter almost in the centre of the former. There was just room for 1 chair between the bed and the wall on Minnie's side, and only a little larger space, accompanied by an ottoman and a small table, upon Mrs. Dale's side. By this time Minnie, who was the most active and efficient sister of the 3, and upon whom the principal responsibilities of the family were laid, was very tired, and soon, very soon, after she had felt her mother lie down by her side, she fell fast asleep. The ladies were lying back to back, Minnie's face being turned to the wall, and her mother's towards the ottoman on the other side of the room. Suddenly Minnie was awakened by a sharp exclamation of seeming terror from her mother, and turning round she beheld the old lady sitting bolt upright in the bed. Her teeth were chattering, her nightcap was awry, and she was shaking in every limb. "What's the matter, mother?" I've seen something," she gasped. "But what? What?" "An old hag, with a villainous face and hanging lips." "Oh, mother, don't you think it's fancy? You know you never sleep well in a strange bed." "It wasn't fancy," answered the terrified woman. "She passed along there," pointing with a shaking hand along the wall. "And when she turned and saw me looking at her, she came close to me in a threatening way, and put her horrid putrid-looking face close into mine. Faugh! I smelt death. She also nodded viciously, and laughed at my fright, showing black slimy teeth. Then she pointed jeeringly with her brown skeleton finger close to my face, and curtsied very low." And the perspiration poured off the poor old lady's face at the recollection. "Dearest mother," said Minnie tenderly, "you are overtired and nervous. Come and sleep this side of the bed, for no one can get at you here between the bed and the wall." And the good daughter helped her mother over into her place, while she lay down in her mother's, feeling convinced that the old lady was suffering from the effects of pickled salmon. Minnie slept peacefully for some time, when suddenly she awoke, feeling curiously uneasy, and for some reason she dreaded to open her eyes. Then, after a second or 2, she began to realize that someone, was very close to her. That in fact a face was almost touching hers, for she smelt a fetid breath, like to what she fancied must be the odour of the grave. With an effort she opened her eyes and beheld the figure of an old woman, who, as the terrified girl started into a sitting posture, retreated to the foot of the bed, seemingly prepared, however, to spring upon its occupant, for she clung to both the bedposts with her brown, claw-like hands, both arms distended, and her head bent slightly forward, her small, lithe body meanwhile swaying to and fro, as though to give it the necessary impetus. The hag's face was the wickedest Minnie had ever seen, and was mottled and brown in colour, as though in a state of decomposition. She wore an old-fashioned mob cap, trimmed with a wreath of roses, an incongruous headdress for so ghastly a head, and a malicious grin parted the charred and blackened lips. She was dressed in a brown silk sack, embroidered all over with pink roses, and Minnie fancied she heard the tapping of high-heeled shoes, as the detestable apparition, seemingly changing its intention, relinquished the bedposts and once more began to approach her, curtsying ironically as though enjoying the girl's terror. But Minnie, being religiously courageous, pulled herself together, and the sacred words seemed to spring solemnly to her lips. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, I bid thee be gone." A mingled expression of fear and malignant hatred appeared in the evil hag's face as Minnie slowly uttered these words. Then the figure shrank, crouched against the wall, and finally disappeared. Minnie knew now that she had seen an evil spirit, and was also convinced that her adjuration had had effect, and that she should never be troubled again in the same way. Those sacred words would always, she felt, have power, complete power, over the devil and his angels. So, in peace, she lay down and slept till morning. She deemed it best to say nothing to her mother of what she had seen, and when the old lady, while dressing the next morning, reiterated her assertion that what she had seen was not a dream, nor had it been nightmare, all that Minnie answered was, she hoped her mother would not relate her experiences to the two sisters who slept upstairs, as it was no use to frighten them. To this Mrs. Dale agreed. The old lady felt nervous all the same for a night or two after the strange occurrence, but being troubled no more by the unpleasant nocturnal visitor, she became quite bold, and began to think that, after all, it might have been the fault of the pickled salmon, and that the Welsh rarebit might also have had something to do with it. Having also a great deal of business to transact in the city, and the rooms being convenient, she decided to stay a fortnight longer in Dash Street. One day, the second sister, Janet, asked for a private word with Minnie, and told her that she, Janet, felt very ill, and that both she and the other sister, Mary by name, fancied there must be something unwholesome in the bedroom in which they slept, as they had neither of them felt well since their séjour in Dash Street. Minnie looked anxiously at her sisters, and could not but acknowledge to herself that they both looked ill, and reproached herself for not having noticed it before. The fortnight was, however, nearly over, so she spoke to her mother, and it was settled that they should leave the very next day, but that they must send for the landlady and tell her so, as she was expecting them to stay a day or two longer. Mrs. Parsons was much put out at the news, and asked the reason of so sudden a departure. Was there anything she could do, or had she left anything undone? As she spoke she looked in a strangely suspicious manner at Mrs. Dale, and murmured, she hoped if there was any reason of complaint, that the ladies would tell her. "Oh no, Mrs. Parsons," answered Mrs. Dale. "We have been most comfortable, but my daughters fancy there is a smell in their bedroom upstairs, and that, consequently, It is not quite wholesome. Can you account for this?" "I hope the young ladies will tell me exactly from what they suffer. Is there anything else besides the smell?" Minnie turned to Janet, who looked as though she could barely stand, and gasped out, "Yes, I will tell the truth, and, Mary, come here and corroborate what I say, for I can bear it no longer. Mrs. Parsons, every night for the last week or more, between the hours of 1 and 3, my sister and I are visited by a villainous old hag." And at the remembrance of what she had gone through, of distress and terror, Janet so nearly swooned that after a few minutes Mary was compelled to become spokeswoman. "Yes," she said, "what Janet says is true. But we kept silence, knowing it was an object to Mother to remain here. The old hag," Mary continued, shuddering, "looks like a devil, and as though she had mouldered for years in her grave. Her lips look as though they were falling off. Horrible, horrible." "Enough," said Mrs. Parsons, holding up her hand. "I know it all, and this cursed house has been my ruin. I ought never to have stayed here, but what can a poor widow do? I got it cheap as it had a bad name, and now, see." She then related that the house had been sold to her cheap by a relative, who had warned her it was haunted by the old woman whom the Dale family had seen. She had never seen the ghost herself, and would not believe in it, but upon making anxious researches, she had discovered that the house was built on the very site of Tyburn, and once when, for sanitary purposes, excavations had been made, a lot of charred bones had been unearthed, thereby attesting to the truth of what she had been told. After hearing her story, Mrs. Dale felt sorry for the woman, and before leaving made her a small present in money, at the same time impressing upon her that it was scarcely fair or honourable for her, under the circumstances, to receive lodgers. She also offered to help her always in any small way she could, and she felt glad afterwards to think she had done so, for not many months later she read in the papers that No. 5 Street had been burnt to the ground, and that the poor landlady's body had been found among the ruins, bearing incontestable signs of the unfortunate woman having, mercifully, been suffocated. Years later, as some workmen were digging on the same spot for fresh foundations, an old coffin was unearthed, and upon its being opened, it was found to contain fragments of a female skeleton, a brown silk gown in wonderful preservation, some human teeth, and a wreath of artificial roses. End of The Tyburn Ghost. Section 2 of 3 Supernatural Stories by Wilhelmina FitzClarence. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bruges Ghost. This story was written down for me by the seer herself, and I repeat it verbatim, as she wrote it. Number 20 is one of the oldest houses in the ancient and beautiful town of Bruges. The building consists of the basement, the ground floor, and 2 sets of apartments above, which we call flats, which are generally occupied by English families. At the time of which I am speaking, an English lady and her 2 daughters lived on the 1st floor, while my mother and my 2 sisters and I were on the 2nd. One night I went to bed as usual, taking with me my small dog, which was always my bedfellow. I had been reading, and just as I turned round to blow out my candle, preparatory to settling myself to sleep, my eye was caught by the appearance of an extraordinary and alarming figure, which stood motionless at the foot of the bed, watching me intently. I was very much frightened, and started into a sitting posture to gaze at the intruder. I said the figure was motionless, but that is scarcely true, for the eyes, which had the vilest expression I ever saw, moved ceaselessly, and followed every motion I made, although the head and body were stationary. The figure was a curious one, and the garment so strange that I could not make out whether the apparition were that of a woman or of a very young man. The hair was jet black, the blackest I ever saw, worn in a kind of fringe low down on the forehead. Above each ear was a bunch of swarthy curls. The eyebrows were tremendously thick and bushy, and shining below them were the small, beady, glittering eyes, the most sinister in expression, which never left my face. The nose and mouth were small and pinched, and the complexion deadly pale. It was altogether a villainous face, and even now I shudder at the horrid memory of those eyes, fixed unswervingly on me, and on my every movement. The apparition's garment, too, was singular. Round the head was wound a sort of hood, caught under the chin, and falling thence straight down, like an enveloping toga, but I could only see as far as the waist, for my bed was one of the foreign wooden ones, with a carved footboard. It takes long to describe the apparition and its peculiarities, but I took it in very quickly, and for a moment wondered whether someone might not be playing me a trick. So when the figure disappeared, which it did suddenly, I, being wide awake, and uncertain as to whether I were frightened or angry, jumped out of bed and rummaged about, behind curtains, under tables, etc., but I found nothing, no one. I was obliged now to turn my attention to my poor little dog, for it seemed painfully distressed, cowering in the bedclothes and whining, and straining its neck to look at the spot where the figure had stood. If I had required any proof of the truth of my unpleasant experience, the dog's agony of terror would have supplied it. I tried to comfort the poor little beast. Then, catching it up in my arms, I hurried with it into my sister's room. I sat there for a few minutes, and after relating the adventure, deemed it wiser to return to the haunted apartment, but the dog refused to go back. He trembled in every limb, and I, fearful lest the poor little beast should have a fit, left him with one of my sisters, the other kindly returning with me to my uncanny room. Strange to say, we both fell asleep, and had a quiet night, but from that moment I never could get the dog to enter that room. It would cry, whine, and struggle, if ever I tried to make it accompany me there to bed, so I had to give it up, and leave him downstairs. The next day I had to go to my dressmaker, who had lived at Bruges almost all her life, and was well known in the town. After fitting and trying on, she casually asked my present address, and upon my giving it she seemed surprised, and said, "Mademoiselle has changed her residence?" I answered we had been only a few days in our present apartments, but her manner was so strange that, prompted by curiosity, I inquired, did she ask the questions for any especial reason? She answered, yes, as she had heard that since the death of the landlord's son, who, she added, was jeune homme très méchant, no one had stayed in the house much, as it was reported to be haunted, especially the bedroom in which he had slept, and died. What did he die of? I asked. Oh, from consumption, so they said, and from the effects of the wickedest life that ever had been lived. And the dressmaker shuddered. But why does mademoiselle ask? Has she seen him? I have seen something, I hesitated. Can you describe to me what he, the young man, was like? Très jeune, très maigre, Pâle comme la mort, les cheveux noirs, boucles dessous des oreilles, les yeux très petits, très menaçants, les sourcils noirs et épais. "That is exactly as I saw him," I exclaimed, and a shudder went all over me. "The young man was a Catholic," the dressmaker added, "and they do say that when those who can't rest in their graves appear thus, especially to the young and innocent, it is that they want their prayers." I returned home, but on my way I visited a good priest with whom I was acquainted, and begged a mass might be said at my expense for the poor restless soul, and I pray God it may be counted to him for righteousness. As for myself, I never saw the young man's ghost again, and we soon left Bruges. Not, however, before, in my work at the hospital there, for I was qualifying for a nurse, I saw a corpse draped for burial, after the Catholic fashion, and straightway I recognized the peculiar garment worn by the apparition in the Bruges bedroom. End of The Bruges Ghost. Section 3 of 3 Supernatural Stories by Wilhelmina FitzClarence. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Mysterious Visitor. A young officer, quartered in an English country town, had been very ill. What his illness had been I do not know. All I do know is that it had been serious. Now, however, he was getting quite well, and his confinement to his bed was purely a precautionary measure, which was to last only a few days longer. He had been well cared for he had been nursed all through his illness by a soldier servant who had lived with him ever since he joined, and besides, he was a very popular character with his brother officers, who were constantly looking in upon him at all hours. Sometimes 3 or 4 of them would come in together, or sometimes one at a time, but they never left him alone for long, and they invariably visited him on their way down to mess dinner in the evening, taking care to tell him any news that might have been going forward during the day, and inventing a good deal that wasn't. On this particular evening of our story, 3 or 4 of the young men had been sitting with him for some time, but now they had just gone down to dinner, and their cheery voices were still to be heard reverberating up the stone staircase, as they larked with one another like so many schoolboys on their way to the dining-room. Our young convalescent lay smiling to himself at the sounds, and wishing he were one of the rollicking party, when he suddenly looked up and was aware of a gentleman, attired in evening clothes, who was standing framed, as it were, in the doorway, and intently watching him. After his first surprise at so unexpected an intrusion, what especially struck our young officer was the newcomer's extraordinary manly beauty. His height alone was very unusual, and gave wonderful dignity to the well-knit, distinguished-looking figure. Then the gentleman's complexion was strangely foreign in its excessive paleness, while the large gloomy eyes and drooping moustaches were the blackest he had ever seen. So impressed, in short, was our convalescent by the unexpected visitor's dignified appearance and lordly bearing, that he felt sure, had he ever seen him before, he could not have forgotten it. The stranger stood for some moments in the doorway, looking earnestly at the young man, little more than a boy, in the bed, then bowing courteously as though in answer to the latter's inquiring gaze, he approached, sat down on the chair at the bedside, and at once began an unembarrassed conversation. First he asked sympathizingly after his involuntary host's health, the cause of his late illness, etc., and thence he proceeded to talk freely and familiarly on all sorts of topics, our convalescent meanwhile becoming every moment more and more fascinated by his new acquaintance's charming voice and pleasant manner. At last, the mystified young officer summoned up courage enough to say that, delightful as this unexpected visit had been to him personally, he could not but fear lest he should be defrauding some other person of the pleasure, especially as he knew that a youngster that had just joined was also ill in bed. Had the gentleman, perchance, come to see the other invalid? "I am afraid," the young man continued, "that you must be taking me for someone else. I certainly never have had the advantage of seeing you before, or I could not have forgotten it." The stranger looked calmly at the boy as he spoke, but said nothing. "I should take it as a great favour," the officer continued, feeling rather surprised at the strange gentleman's silence, "if you would give me your name and address, so that I may look forward to the pleasure of calling on you when I get out again, which will be in a few days now." The stranger still remained silent, in spite of the young man's request, and then, in a few minutes, went on quietly talking on other subjects, as though he had not taken in what he meant. "I wonder who on earth he is," the officer thought. "Some swell, I'll swear. Beastly kind of him to come and see me, anyhow." And yet he felt rather uneasy. After a while, when the stranger had brought forward and discussed all sorts of interesting subjects, our invalid could no longer restrain his curiosity, or his determination to discover his new and fascinating friend's name. "You really must tell me who you are," the young man said. "It will be such a real pleasure to me to go and see you." Then he added, still believing the gentleman was taking him for someone else, "Such a friendship is very pleasant, although it may have begun accidentally, by mistake." "Oh no," answered the stranger, in his curiously musical voice. "I have made no mistake. Your name is Reginald B., and I came a long way to see you." "How very good of you," said Reginald gratefully, and colouring with pleasure. "And now, pray add to your kindness by telling me to whom I am indebted for so jolly an evening." The stranger looked musingly at Reginald, and answered quietly, "Do you really wish to know my name?" "Yes, indeed," said Reginald heartily. "Then I will tell you. My name is Satan." "Come, come," answered Reginald, decidedly startled. "I can't be expected to believe that." And he began to suspect his fascinating companion of being an escaped lunatic. The dark man, who had been watching the young soldier intently, seemed to divine at once the unspoken thought. "No," he said, "I am not mad, and I quite understand your difficulty in crediting my words. I am prepared, however, to prove their truth." "How?" asked Reginald. "Well, ask me any difficult question you like. Ask me anything, past or present, that you wish to know. Ask me any secret you alone know, and I will tell you all about it. Or, if you prefer it, ask me in short any secret you wish to know, and by my answer and supernatural knowledge, I will prove to you that I am what I say I am. That is, the devil." A creeping sense of uneasiness had now come over the young soldier, who, although no coward, was, after all, weak from recent illness, and felt, small blame to him, most men would have done the same, that a visit, while he lay helpless in bed, from either a lunatic or from the devil, was by no means a pleasant contingency. But a lunatic he may be, argued poor Reginald, but the devil? Pah! Nonsense! Turning to his uncanny companion, therefore, he said with a forced laugh, "Well, there is a secret in my family, which I have wished to discover for long, and if you can unravel that mystery, then I will really believe that you are, well, not human." The stranger bowed gravely. After the interview, Reginald remembered the dark man had never once smiled, and once more repeated, "Ask me what you like, and I will answer and tell you all you wish to know." "Then here goes!" exclaimed Reginald, who meanwhile experienced an uneasy sensation as though he were pandering to, and tampering with, something evil. "I had an elder brother who died quite a baby, whom I never saw, and, strangely enough, my mother would never allow me to mention his death, or, indeed, that he had ever lived. Now, I want to know about him, how he died, and also the reason of my mother's extraordinary reticence upon the subject. Can you tell me this?" "Oh, that's easy enough," the strange visitor said. "Listen, and I will tell you the story. Years ago, before you were born, your parents went a sea voyage in a sailing vessel. They took with them their firstborn son, then a very young child. About a week after they had sailed, your mother was on deck, playing with her little son, of whom she was very proud. Your father and the captain of the vessel both stood by, and watched her as she tossed the baby up in the air, as mothers will, and caught it again. Other eyes, not human ones, were also watching this dangerous play. Suddenly, just as your mother was tossing her little son up in the air, the ship gave a lurch. She failed to catch the laughing, crowing, kicking baby. It fell overboard, and in one moment, under their very eyes, it was swallowed by a shark that had been noticed following and dogging the vessel for days. No one witnessed the tragedy except your parents and the captain, and the wretched mother was in such a distracted state, foolishly and unreasoningly fearing lest she should be blamed and accused, that to quiet the frantic woman, the two men weakly, and at her urgent prayer, took a solemn oath then and there, never to divulge the secret of the child's death, thus foolishly and quite unnecessarily saddling themselves all their lives long with a bugbear in the form of a haunting mystery. Your father once or twice endeavoured to convince your mother of the folly of concealment, but whenever he broached the subject, her painful excitement and agitation warned him it was better to leave things as they were, and more especially as no one seemed ever to have heard anything about it. There, continued the stranger, that is the whole mystery, which in fact need have been no mystery at all, had your mother not chosen to make it one. After relating this extraordinary, and rather unlikely, story, the dark gentleman rose abruptly from the chair, said he could stay no longer that time, bid his astonished host good night, walked to the centre of the room, and vanished, went out, as it were, like the flame of a match, while the young soldier gazed at him, unable to utter a word. A few minutes later the soldier servant entered the room, and said, "I came in twice before, sir, with your physic, but you seemed so occupied with the strange gentleman that I did not like to disturb you. Will you take it now?" So his servant, the young man said to himself, had seen the uncanny visitor too. Therefore people would be unable to say, as they would if they could, that he had been either drunk or dreaming when he related to them his extraordinary experience. Directly our hero was alone, he wrote to his mother and asked her, was the story true? In a few days he received an answer, written by that lady in a most excited state. She asked, firstly, how could he possibly have heard the circumstance, and, secondly, from whom could he have heard it? It had happened, she said, so many years ago, and as the only two witnesses besides herself had been his father and the captain, and as they were both now dead, from whom could he have heard it? She was, however, bound to confess that what he had heard was true to the letter. But how had he heard it? Your dear father, she wrote, died as a young man, soon after you were born, and the captain died the same year. He was drowned. On the day your father died, he strongly urged me to tell the terrible story to you, but I never could summon up the courage. Now you know it, but how? It only remains for me to add that Reginald's brother officers declared positively that he was neither delirious nor drunk, nor even excited, when, on that same evening, the mess dinner being over, and they came to bid him good night, he told them calmly and deliberately all about his mysterious visitor. Reginald has never seen the dark gentleman again, and he hopes he never may. But he dislikes very much being left long alone. He came for some object, he says, and that object not having been yet obtained, he is not the one to give up without another try. But God defend the right. End of A Mysterious Visitor. And end of 3 Supernatural Stories by Wilhelmina FitzClarence. Thank you for listening.